Hello and welcome to the fourth installment on our Early Republic series. So far, we've taken a look at the Articles of Confederation and how that failed. We looked at the need for a constitution and them having a constitutional convention to actually write the thing, and then the ratification process after we evened out all those Federalist and anti-Federalist arguments. Today we're going to take a little bit of a time out from the actual historical events, and we're going to reflect on how these events have been interpreted over time. Now, this goes back to our first unit of study, historiography, and in that study of history, in the telling of history, we saw that, often history is told as a reflection of one's own time, and that is still the case today. So today we're going to take a look at how the Constitution in this early Republic period has been reflected on over the course of decades and centuries since the initial events themselves, and again, how it reflects more ourselves at the time than anything. So get out your notes. Let's go ahead and begin here. This, by the way, this is going to be our shortest lecture of the series, so that might be a good or bad thing, depending on how well you like these things. So again, we're going to look at interpretations of the Revolution and the Constitution, kind of balling them all up together. And the real question here is why? Why did the Revolution happen? Why was the Constitution written? Who stood to gain advantage from that? Were these revolutions truly revolutionary, as we've already discussed? Who did they benefit the most? These are all questions that should be asked and should be answered. Now, early on in kind of the early scholarly look at the American Revolution, one of the first to really kind of put some analysis behind it was a book published in 1923 called The American Revolution, A Constitutional Interpretation. And this style of historian takes a look at what I refer to as constitutional conflict, as to why the revolution even started in the first place. That it was about the Constitution at this point, but not the U.S. Constitution. It was actually about the failure of the English Constitution to actually defend the rights of American colonists. They, according to this interpretation, the revolution was brought about because the Constitution of Great Britain had failed, that the English Constitution was violating the rights of Englishmen, and that revolution and the U.S. Constitution was the only way to correct those injustices. So, there had been, again, there's been different ideas on why the revolution started. I want to remind you that history is always complex, and if anybody tells you that a singular reason for an event happened, they're wrong. It is undoubtedly bombarded by different causations, and you have to understand that. But what this is saying is that this was a major part of it, that what they as Englishmen in America, they saw as injustice. They saw their rights being diminished, that they had no representation. They were being taxed without that representation. They saw that as the biggest push for a revolution, and the result of which would eventually turn into a constitution. So to correct those injustices, really over interpretations of constitutions. The second area I want to take a look at are the more progressive historians, and they tended to focus, and again, we're at the early 20th century here. 1913 is when Charles Beard's book, An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States, comes out. And, at this point, think about what's happening in America. This is during the Industrial Revolution. Frankly, we're seeing a lot of corruption, with political machines in American cities. We're seeing, a lot of greed. We're seeing the wealth of the robber barons versus the wealth declining for your average citizen. And so Beard takes on a very economic view of why the revolution occurred and why the Constitution was put in place. So again, the progressive historians, if you remember back to your Reform era, your American history, that progressive era where, they were breaking up Standard Oil and they were doing things to, help your common man. This is kind of in the vein that Beard is writing. he saw that the most important factor leading to the Constitution was the wealth and economics of the framers of that Constitution. He is arguing that the main purpose, the main structure of the Constitution itself was primarily motivated by personal financial interests of the Founding Fathers. And it is very true that some of these guys were the wealthiest men in the entire country. George Washington was the wealthiest man in the entire country. He had a vast plantation. He had the largest whiskey company in the country. I mean, these guys often did have a lot of wealth, and what Beard's saying is that they put a constitution in place to protect that wealth. Now, in his book, he actually analyzes each one of the founding fathers and describes how each stood to benefit from the U.S. Constitution. And again, George Washington's a major figure in his book because he argues that Washington had personally taken on a tremendous debt. He had given money to the cause during the Revolution, and that debt was owed back to him. The only way to actually make sure his debt could be forgiven, or not forgiven, but reimbursed, was by having a national federal government in which they could reimburse, could actually tax the people and reimburse. So he's saying, listen, Washington's as far as you need to go to understand that these guys stood to benefit economically from the Constitution. And, listen, there may be some of that. I think where Beard kind of fails is saying that is the only reason. And again, taking a complex issue and whittling it down to a simple narrative, it just often does not cover all your bases. So, a lot of people have been critical of Beard. There is probably some truth to it. I mean, many of these men did stand to economically benefit from the Constitution, but that might not be the entire reason that they did it. The next up, and we're going to focus more on what's called the consensus interpretation. This is kind of a combining of previous interpretations. And by the way, this is obviously a very quick look at this. I mean, there has been scholarly work on the Constitution and the reasons for it, I mean, ever since it was written. So we're just very much taking a simplified look. So feel free to dig deeper if this is something you're into. So the consensus interpretation, kind of combining the above elements and trying to understand, what are some other factors that may have been present. And so this in particular, you'll notice that the two books we're going to highlight here come from 1950s. This is post-World War II America, one of the most prosperous periods in American history. The baby boom is going on in the 1950s. So, they saw a focus on democracy. And again, we just fought this war in the name of democracy, to bring democracy throughout the world. And it makes sense that the historians of that day would focus on that aspect of the revolution and the Constitution. So they kind of almost limit the revolutionary aspects of overthrowing governments. Instead, it was standing up for what was right, standing up for democracy, the voice of the common man. The first book I want to take a look at was called Middle Class Democracy and the Revolution in Massachusetts, and the study was done from 1691, it's back colonial period, up through 1780 after the Revolution, by Robert Brown. In this book, the argument was about the emphasis is on democracy and how really it was the middle class of the colonial population that was pushing to have their voice heard, that it was democracy from within the colonies themselves, then the need to have a representative government that led to the revolution and ultimately the Constitution itself. So the impetus for change and revolution was not economics, it was not anything else, it was about democracy. It was about having voices heard and being represented in government. In 1958, a very influential book called We the People was published by Forrest McDonald, written by Forrest McDonald. And the argument is frankly the antithesis of Charles Beard's argument, economic argument. And We the People basically goes into saying that it was not just greed that caused the revolution to occur and the Constitution to be written. In fact, he even goes in and highlights how many of the founding fathers, framers of the Constitution, however you refer to them, actually says that they actually had more risk because of that, and they actually stood to lose money because of that. One thing he noted was about 1/4 of the delegates voted in state legislatures for debt relief laws, meaning that, this was more focus on, your local farmers and things like that, not necessarily for, paying off. It was kind of a focus on lower levels of citizens than actually reimbursing, those that had major debts. He notes that another fourth had economic interests adversely affected by the Constitution, because most of the founding fathers actually didn't have debt that needed to be reimbursed. Most of them were major property holders, and they wouldn't necessarily serve to benefit from a Constitution. And frankly, if anything, they would stand to kind of lose out by giving up more localized power to a federal government. And one important note, I think this is one of the most damning to Charles Beard, is that if this was truly the case, that the Revolution and the Constitution was all formed due to economic greed, he says, look at how they debated this and how close it actually was, because ratification was not a for sure thing, as we mentioned. They did not act as a solidified, consolidated economic group. And that goes against Beard's argument. He's saying, look, they almost didn't ratify this thing. And if it was truly just about benefiting them, the people in positions of power with wealth, they would have passed it, in a heartbeat. But he said, they debated this, and in some states it didn't pass, like Rhode Island for the first time. Personal debt was not something that was incurred by each state. Some states had more debt than others. He said, some states did have unanimous votes. New Jersey, Delaware, Georgia, they all voted unanimously. But, it was very obvious that different interests were held in different areas. Agrarian interests, of course, more important in the South than industrial interests. So he's saying it's not an economically cohesive group. Not everybody's in the same situation. Therefore, you cannot apply the same logic to everyone, saying that everyone benefited, these founding fathers, by this Constitution, that it didn't benefit everybody in the same way. And especially with the debt interest, some of the more northern states, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York, Rhode Island, they were the only ones that actually held debt in large amounts. That it was, if the whole idea was to make sure that debt got repaid, those were the only states that had actually benefited, and that wasn't enough to actually ratify it. So he also points to the lower level. Farmers were more in support than this than you may think, that it wasn't necessarily about debt for them. So he criticizes Beard, saying, ultimately, you've created a generalization saying that this absolutely economically benefited all the founding fathers, and that's not the case. That each state was different, they had different focuses, and that there may be more idealistic causes behind it, the pushes for democracy, like Brown had suggested a few years before. So ultimately, what the consensus interpretation of the Revolution and the Constitution says is that that really republicanism, the idea of pushing for a democratic republic, is what caused the Revolution and the Constitution to take place. That was more important than economics. It was actually about the freedom of the people to have a voice in their government. And I think we still retain, for the most part, that interpretation today, although sometimes you'll see the economic push made every now and then. Guys, that'll do it for this lecture, our shortest of the series. So again, you might be celebrating that. But if you have any questions or would like further reading on this topic, I'd be happy to help you out. Just shoot me an email and I'll get back to you. Thanks a lot for paying attention.